Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. This week, we begin in the Americas, where a deadly gang attack near Port-au-Prince has again highlighted Haiti's deteriorating security environment. We also look at whether opposition to a new diesel policy could trigger another nationwide protest movement in Bolivia. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we assess a series of incidents attributed to Russia and whether Moscow is increasingly testing NATO's resolve. We also examine Iran's shift towards an offensive military posture as the United States turns to economic pressure, and what this could mean for shipping and energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Elsewhere, we look ahead to Guinea-Bissau's constitutional referendum, rising tensions in Ethiopia's Tigray region, the resurgence of Somali piracy, and why fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo is likely to continue despite progress in peace talks. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine the aftermath of devastating flash floods along the Nepal-Tibet border, a coordinated wave of attacks across Thailand's deep south, and the potential for disruption as March for Australia demonstrations take place nationwide on August 30th. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where a deadly gang attack near Haiti's capital has highlighted the continued deterioration of the country's security environment. On the night of August 23rd, heavily armed members of the Vive Ansam gang coalition carried out a large-scale attack in Kenskoff, a mountainous commune approximately 10 kilometers southeast of the capital, Port-au-Prince. The attack targeted multiple locations across the town and surrounding areas, including residential neighborhoods, vehicles, and a church being used to shelter internally displaced persons. According to UN channels, at least 47 people were killed and 22 injured. However, an exact casualty figure remains difficult to determine due to local insecurity and challenges in accessing the area. Several people were also reportedly abducted, while local homes were set on fire and livestock attacked. In response, the Haitian government placed security forces on heightened alert and announced that reinforcements would be sent to the area. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Vive Ansam gang coalition was formed in 2023 through a merger of several powerful gangs, including G9 and GPEP. It currently controls approximately 90% of the Haitian capital and has expanded into 3 of Haiti's 10 departments. Led by former police officer Jimmy Barbecue Cherizier, the gang has sometimes styled itself as a political force and demanded a role in government. In practice, however, it has systematically attacked government institutions, as well as non-government actors providing basic services, including churches and NGOs engaged in humanitarian relief efforts. The Kenskoff area has long been an epicenter of clashes between government forces and gangs, with periodic violence continuing since 2024, and clashes recorded as recently as mid-August 2026. Kenskoff is strategically important because it lies on the Kenskoff-Marigot Road, one of the main routes leading to Port-au-Prince. Much of the area also sits at an elevation of approximately 1,500 to 2,000 meters. This gives armed groups controlling the surrounding hills commanding positions over key roads and approaches to the capital, as well as the commune of Pétionville, an area under government control where numerous government offices, banks and embassies are located. Gaining full control of Kenskoff would likely give the gangs greater ability to pressure Pétionville and other government-held areas. It would also place them in a better position to disrupt one of the remaining routes between Port-au-Prince and southern Haiti, which largely remains under government control. Isolating southern Haiti from the capital would also likely help the gangs consolidate power in the capital region by restricting government reinforcement and resupply routes. The UN Security Council authorized gang suppression force was established in September 2025 to replace the Kenyan-led multinational security support mission, but has yet to reach full operational capacity. The GSF currently has only around 1,000 personnel deployed in Haiti, but is set to reach 5,550. Securing control of Kenskof is likely a key objective for the gangs before the GSF reaches full operational capacity, as this would help disrupt future counter-gang operations. Further offensives on Kenskof are highly likely before the GSF expands its presence and counter-gang operations. The attack also occurred only days before August 30th, the original date for Haiti's first-round elections, before the timetable was revised in July. Haiti's last elections were held in 2016, and elections have been repeatedly delayed since 2019. The government is now proposing to hold elections on December 13, 2026. Large-scale attacks have likely further undermined the central government's authority and reduced its ability to create the security conditions required for elections. Disrupting or preventing a national election is likely another key objective for the gangs as they seek to preserve their influence and control. Staying in the Americas, we turn to Bolivia, where opposition to the removal of diesel subsidies for large consumers could develop into a much broader protest movement. Producers and transport organizations across Bolivia have issued ultimatums and threatened roadblocks in response to the government's Supreme Decree 5676. The decree entered into force on August 16th and removed the diesel subsidy for large consumers, setting an initial price of 18 bolivianos per litre. The measure has been widely opposed by agricultural producers and other sectors, who argue that higher fuel costs will increase production and consumer prices. Several groups have staged small-scale, localized protests in direct response to the decree. On August 18th, the National Commission of Sugarcane Producers of Bolivia staged a protest outside a state energy company in Santa Cruz. Then, on August 20th, agricultural producers and sugarcane growers in northern Santa Cruz temporarily blocked the Santa Cruz-Cochabamba highway at Montero. On August 23rd, producers in San Julian issued a 48-hour ultimatum and threatened an indefinite road blockade. Peasant farmers and agricultural organizations from Warnes, Obispo Santisteban, Sara and Ichilo provinces similarly threatened roadblocks unless the decree was repealed. The Confederation of Drivers of Bolivia also declared a state of emergency, while the 6 federations of the Tropic of Cochabamba stated that they had begun mobilizing against the decree. On August 24th and 25th, organizations in Yapachani threatened to block the Santa Cruz-Cochabamba highway, while agricultural groups in Beni province announced an indefinite road blockade from August 26th. On August 26th, producers in Beni established an indefinite blockade of the Santa Cruz-Trinidad highway. The blockade was temporarily suspended following talks with the government, but producers gave the authorities 48 hours to repeal the decree, threatening to renew roadblocks if their demands were not met. Now, our intelligence team's assessment: Bolivia has experienced at least 10 major protest movements since 2020, resulting in paralyzing roadblocks, widespread disruption, mass arrests, fatalities, and significant economic losses. The most recent cycle occurred in May and June 2026. It lasted more than 50 days, reached around 150 roadblocks at its peak, and resulted in Bolivia being placed under a nationwide state of emergency. The state of emergency permitted the deployment of the armed forces in support of the police, restrictions on freedom of movement and assembly, and the prohibition of roadblocks on major urban, rural, and interdepartmental routes. The declaration of a state of emergency, which came after weeks of signaling, resulted in the rapid dismantling of most major roadblocks and a significant reduction in protest activity. However, the establishment of temporary roadblocks on August 26th indicates that protesters are likely to renew these tactics if their demands are not met, in defiance of the state of emergency. Previous protest movements that coincided with an active state of emergency have resulted in violent confrontations between protesters and the security forces, including mass arrests, injuries, and fatalities, particularly when security forces have attempted to clear roadblocks. While current threats to mobilize and establish roadblocks have yet to translate into widespread disruption, there are multiple early indicators and warnings that protest activity is likely to intensify. The government has refused to repeal Supreme Decree 5676, while multiple agricultural, transport, and rural organizations have issued ultimatums or threatened indefinite roadblocks. This increases the likelihood that the dispute will escalate if ongoing sector-level negotiations fail. Moreover, many of the previous grievances that have triggered protest movements remain extant, including the perceived persecution of former President Evo Morales, fuel shortages, and dissatisfaction with the new right-wing administration's economic policies. Now turning to Europe, where a series of incidents attributed to Russia has raised questions over whether Moscow is increasingly testing NATO's resolve. On August 25th, CIA Director John Ratcliffe made an unannounced visit to Moscow, traveling via Latvia aboard a U.S. Air Force C-17 Globemaster. According to undisclosed sources, Ratcliffe delivered a direct warning to Russian officials not to escalate the conflict with U.S. NATO allies, particularly the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Russia was also reportedly asked to reduce its support for Iran. The unannounced visit follows a series of escalations across Europe that have been linked to Russia. U.S. intelligence had also warned in early August that President Putin may attempt to widen the fighting in Europe in order to enable a breakthrough in Ukraine. On August 20th, a Romanian F-16 fighter jet engaged an unmanned surface vessel in Romania's exclusive economic zone, close to the Neptune Deep Gas project. Romania's defense minister Radu Miruța stated that the vessel was armed with explosives and was not Ukrainian, while President Nicolae Dan attributed it to Russia. Russian strikes have damaged 3 Ukrainian border crossings with Moldova since August 20th. Ukraine's foreign minister, Andriy Sybiha, described this as a clear pattern of Russia increasingly testing the resolve of NATO and its partners. On August 22nd, a Polish military analyst assessed that a Russian Koch-101 cruise missile, which struck a field 95 kilometers inside Poland on July 30th, was likely deliberate. The analyst cited Polish Major General Maciej Jabłonski, who stated that the missile performed a terminal maneuver only possible using pre-programmed coordinates and hit exactly where it was supposed to hit. On August 25th, German media reported that investigators had recovered a third unmanned aerial vehicle on August 14th, west of Leipzig-Halle Airport, along with approximately 50 grams of suspected military-grade explosives. The UAV is assessed as linked to the explosive-laden drone found near an Antonov Airlines An-124, used to transport Ukrainian military cargo at the same airport overnight from August 4th to 5th. On August 22nd and 23rd, U.S. media reported, citing Western intelligence officials, that Russian officers had rehearsed mobilization procedures in Kaliningrad in July. The officials also indicated that Russia could seek to seize part of the Suwałki Gap, which links Kaliningrad with Belarus through Poland and Lithuania, as part of an escalation with the West. Furthermore, on August 21st, Latvia announced the discovery of a second tunnel from Belarus being used to smuggle migrants into the EU. Lithuanian border guards have also discovered at least 3 tunnels in recent weeks. On August 24th, UK Prime Minister Andy Burnham announced in Kiev that he had authorized the release of classified technical data on British components of the Scalp/Storm Shadow cruise missile to enable domestic Ukrainian production. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Moscow viewed the decision extremely negatively. and that Russian forces were attempting to identify missile production sites. At a coalition of the Willing meeting on August 24th, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that Russia will try to escalate against European countries in order to deter them from assisting Ukraine. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Recently observed Russian activity, or incidents widely attributed to Russia, highly likely represent a deliberate and calibrated intensification of operations against European NATO members. The developments follow reporting from early August in US media, citing US intelligence assessments warning that Russia may seek to test NATO's resolve between autumn 2026 and 2029. Potential scenarios range from large-scale cyber attacks to limited land incursions. They also follow earlier direct US warnings to Poland that Russia is planning an armed provocation. The US warnings reportedly mark a shift from earlier intelligence assessments, which judged that Russian President Vladimir Putin was unlikely to escalate directly against a NATO member while committed in Ukraine. However, plausible courses of action remain sub-threshold, asymmetric, and highly deniable. If confirmed as deliberate, the Kuch-101 cruise missile impact in Poland likely marks a significant escalation, as the first direct armed Russian missile strike on NATO territory during the war in Ukraine. Previous impacts have been associated with stray missiles or Ukrainian air defense operations. Having landed in a remote area, the strike would likely represent a provocation calculated to test NATO responses and resolve while remaining sub-threshold. However, the direct targeting of border crossings used by NATO members to facilitate lethal aid into Ukraine, as well as the plot to target aircraft at Leipzig-Halle Airport, likely mark a shift towards more direct attempts to disrupt Western military support. These actions also carry a higher risk of casualties and escalation. Russia has sustained asymmetric and highly deniable operations against NATO members since the start of the conflict, seeking to impose costs, threaten escalation, and deter support for Ukraine. However, the recent Russian escalation can likely be explained by several factors. Russia likely calculates that the war in Ukraine, combined with conflict in the Middle East, has greatly diminished US and European stockpiles of kit and equipment, while also shifting US priorities. Estimates indicate that US air defense stocks have been critically depleted, with much of the remaining stock also being reallocated to the Middle Eastern theater. The US has also been forced to withdraw capabilities from the Pacific theater, significantly reducing its deterrence against China. European NATO members' air defense and other capabilities have also almost certainly been significantly reduced by transfers to Ukraine. At the same time, the war has become increasingly politically divisive, with growing public disagreement over the scale, duration, and risks of continued support for Ukraine, including in some of Ukraine's primary benefactors, such as France and Germany. Ukraine has also significantly escalated its deep strike campaign. Strikes against Russian military industry, hydrocarbon infrastructure, and more recently, commercial logistics have almost certainly imposed high costs on Russia. Attacks in major cities have also undermined the Kremlin's ability to project security and insulate the civilian population from the effects of the conflict. Russia has responded with an escalation of its own, increasing attacks on Ukrainian transport, ports, civilian shipping, warehouses, and other logistics or civilian infrastructure. However, Russian strikes have not deterred Ukraine from sustaining its campaign. This has likely reinforced Russian incentives to widen the target set and increase attacks on Ukraine's wider logistics network, including targets within NATO territory, both to actively disrupt Ukrainian sustainment and to deter support through the threat of escalation. Ratcliffe's visit to Moscow is the first known visit to Russia by a CIA director since November 2021, when William Burns traveled to Moscow and met Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev to warn the Kremlin that Washington was aware of preparations for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin has stated that Ratcliffe met with Russian intelligence services and denied that he met with Putin. While the trip likely covered several areas, as undisclosed sources have suggested, its primary focus was to warn Moscow against further escalation targeting NATO members. It may also have included explicit warnings over potential US courses of action. A limited Russian incursion into NATO territory remains unlikely in the near term. However, the Kremlin has almost certainly grown increasingly less risk-averse as it fails to achieve a major breakthrough in Ukraine and in response to Kiev's strike campaign, which has increasingly exposed the Russian population and economy to the direct costs of the conflict. In the short term, the Kremlin's most likely course of action is to increase its use of highly deniable and sub-threshold operations. These are likely to include expanded cyber and electronic warfare activity, sabotage of Ukrainian supply chains, UAV incursions and airport disruption, influence operations, and increased signaling that threatens escalation. Such signaling could include snap exercises near NATO borders, increased naval signaling, the deployment of nuclear-capable systems or strategic forces, and clear threats against European critical national infrastructure, such as vessels loitering over submarine cables and other undersea infrastructure. Turning to the Middle East, Iran's shift towards a more offensive military posture could increase the risk of renewed escalation as the United States continues to apply economic pressure. On August 24th, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent announced the launch of Operation Economic Outcast, which he described as an unprecedented campaign against Iran and its enablers and an economic D-Day. The operation expands the categories of activities subject to U.S. secondary sanctions to include digital assets, technology, gold, aviation, and shipping. The U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control also designated more than 60 entities, individuals, and vessels assessed to be involved in Iranian nuclear and missile procurement, cyber operations, or oil revenue generation. Iran's currency subsequently fell to a record low against the U.S. dollar. In an article published in the British media, Bessent stated that the economic campaign could reduce the need for American force against Iran. U.S. officials cited by U.S. media also indicated that expanded secondary sanctions are expected to remain the primary instrument against Iran until at least after the U.S. midterm elections. After that, a renewed military campaign could again be considered. Reporting on August 25th, citing a U.S. official, said that U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio had told allies in recent days that the U.S. was not expecting to conduct renewed strikes on Iran for the time being. According to an internal U.S. State Department document obtained by U.S. media and reported on August 25th, the department is preparing to send diplomatic staff back to embassies in the Middle East. It is also preparing to scale back emergency measures at its missions that were introduced due to the conflict. Earlier, on August 22nd, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Mohsen Rezai, stated that any country participating in economic restrictions against Iran would be regarded as an enemy, warning of seismic retaliation. Rezai further warned Iran's neighbors that if they participated in the U.S. economic campaign, not even a drop of oil would leave the Gulf region, including via export routes that bypass the Strait of Hormuz. In an interview with regime media on August 26th, a spokesperson for Iran's conventional army, the Artesh Brigadier General Mohammad Akraminia, set out 4 principles of Iran's revised doctrine, framing the change as a shift from a defensive to an offensive posture. These comprise rapid response, disproportionate retaliation, preemptive action against U.S. assets, and geographic target expansion to encompass adversary interests across the region. Akraminia explicitly named energy hubs, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and undersea internet cables. On August 23, Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority stated that vessels breaching its transit protocols would face fines, detention, or confiscation, and directed cargo owners to a published non-compliant vessels list. Any vessel cooperating with a listed vessel, including through ship-to-ship transfers or transshipment, would be added to the list with immediate effect. On August 25, President Trump announced that the U.S. Navy had cleared all mines from the main shipping lane in the Strait of Hormuz. The same day, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations reported that an oil tanker had been struck by an unidentified projectile in the Strait of Hormuz near the Omani coast. The strike damaged the vessel's engine room and disabled it. Pakistan's Chief of Army Staff, Field Marshal Asim Munir, accompanied by Pakistan's Interior Minister, traveled to Tehran on August 24 as part of Pakistan's continuing role as a mediator between the US and Iran. Oman's Foreign Minister, Saeed Badr al-Busaidi, visited Tehran on August 25 to continue Iran-Oman talks on the management of the Strait of Hormuz. While Iran's deputy foreign minister stated that an agreement had been reached, a senior Iranian source told international media that the deal had not been finalized. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The combination of US Treasury messaging on economic coercion as a substitute for kinetic force, Rubio's reported private assurances to allies, and reported plans to return diplomatic staff to regional posts indicate that the US is unlikely to initiate major offensive operations against Iran in the short term. However, the risk that Iran now initiates offensive escalation has highly likely risen. Iran's principal leverage in the conflict has almost certainly been derived from its ability to interdict transit through the Strait of Hormuz. This leverage has likely been degraded recently. The establishment of a US-escorted corridor along the Omani coast, the widespread adoption of nighttime dark transits, and the rerouting of Gulf exports away from the Strait of Hormuz entirely have likely restored a notable proportion of regional export capacity. Moreover, reported transit and export volumes are likely higher than publicly tracked figures indicate, due to the use of dark transits and ship-to-ship transfers to obfuscate export activity. The combination of degraded maritime leverage and intensified economic pressure through Operation Economic Outcast likely increases Tehran's incentive to escalate militarily. This would aim both to demonstrate that the Strait of Hormuz cannot be transited without its consent, and to restore its negotiating position before its remaining leverage is further degraded. Iranian escalation aimed at reasserting control over the Strait of Hormuz, restoring Iranian leverage, and imposing costs on the US and its allies is likely in the coming weeks. Iran's most likely course of action is to increase attacks against commercial vessels using the southern transit corridor, and may also involve further limited mining operations. However, these actions will likely increase the risk of direct military confrontation with the US, which has yet to conduct any meaningful force reductions in the region. Attacks against Gulf state energy infrastructure, ports and airports, as well as US military installations, would represent a more significant escalation. The risk of this is highly likely to increase if Gulf states and other major trading partners comply with US sanctions, and if Tehran fails to effectively circumnavigate those sanctions. Iran's new SNSC head, Rizai, has already made direct threats against regional energy infrastructure. His specific reference to export routes bypassing the Strait of Hormuz likely indicates that Tehran is framing Saudi Arabia's Red Sea infrastructure at Yanbu, alongside pipeline, port, and loading infrastructure in the UAE, particularly at Fujairah, as legitimate targets if it assesses that Gulf states are supporting the US economic campaign. Moreover, the four principles outlined by the Iranian Artesh spokesperson, Akraminia, codify the lowering of Iran's threshold for the first use of force and widen the scope of legitimate targets. The preemptive action principle, in particular, almost certainly indicates an increased risk of Iran initiating an exchange. Akraminia cited the July 28 strike on Muwafaq Sulti Air Base in Azraq, Jordan, despite a lack of U.S. offensive action, as evidence of the doctrinal shift. The stated trigger of an adversary assembling personnel and equipment is broad enough that routine force rotations, air defense deployments, or naval movements could be interpreted by Iran as indicators and warnings of an imminent attack, and used to justify a preemptive strike. This highly likely increases the risk of miscalculation. Iran had previously pursued a strategy of analogous targeting, whereby it would respond to attacks by striking broadly comparable targets across the region. However, the disproportionate retaliation principle likely represents a shift away from this approach. The new doctrine likely indicates that Iran is willing to escalate rapidly and broaden the criteria for both the scale and type of targets it considers legitimate in the event of renewed escalation. The geographic targeting expansion makes explicit threats to adversary interests across the region, including energy hubs, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, and undersea internet cables. However, the concept remains poorly defined, and Iran's interpretation of the region could extend beyond the Gulf. Iran or Iranian-backed groups have previously been linked to attacks in Egypt, Azerbaijan, Cyprus, and Turkey. There is a realistic possibility that this threat may also extend to targets outside the immediate conflict zone. Iran has also threatened attacks in Bulgaria and other European states. Pakistani and Omani diplomatic activity in Tehran on August 24th and 25th highly likely reflects continued attempts by regional powers to prevent the collapse of the diplomatic track. However, with no direct US-Iran channel in place, Iranian preconditions highly likely unchanged, and Washington committed to escalating economic pressure to compel compliance, a near-term breakthrough is unlikely. The Iran-Oman track on the management of the Strait of Hormuz remains the most likely source of progress. However, Iranian officials have consistently stated that an agreement with Oman would not result in the strait reopening until the US meets Iran's conditions set out in the Memorandum of Understanding. In West Africa, attention is turning to Guinea-Bissau's constitutional referendum, which is likely to strengthen the presidency and consolidate the military's influence over the political system. On August 30th, Bissau Guineans will vote in a referendum on a constitutional amendment that has already been unilaterally approved by the military-appointed National Transitional Council. The proposed constitution would retain Guinea-Bissau's formal designation as a semi-presidential system, while substantially strengthening the presidency. Under the proposed amendments, the president would serve as head of state, direct the executive and chair the Council of Ministers. The Prime Minister would remain head of government, but would become subordinate to the President. Accordingly, the President would appoint and dismiss the Prime Minister after consulting parliamentary parties, while retaining the power to dissolve the legislature. The National People's Assembly, Guinea-Bissau's parliament, would retain its legislative oversight functions, but would be renamed the National Assembly, with its membership reduced from 102 to 65. Additionally, parties that fail to secure at least 4% of the vote in parliamentary elections could be dissolved. The referendum forms part of the transition process established following the November 26, 2025 military coup. Following the referendum, elections to restore civilian rule are scheduled for December 6, 2026. Now, our intelligence team's assessment: the constitutional referendum is highly likely to pass. Guinea-Bissau's shift towards a more presidential system is being framed as a means of reducing institutional conflict and political paralysis, as executive authority is currently divided ambiguously between the president and prime minister. This unclear division of power has repeatedly triggered disputes over control of the government, and only one president since 1994 has completed their term in office. The constitutional reform will highly likely benefit the military-led transitional authority. While the government's stated motivation is to end repeated political deadlocks, the proposed constitutional amendments would substantially strengthen the executive ahead of the planned general elections. Alongside conferring popular legitimacy on a constitution drafted and approved under military rule, the changes would largely centralize authority in the presidency, giving one individual substantial control over the state. Additionally, the reforms would enable the transitional authorities to determine the institutional structure under which the next government will operate, meaning that opposition parties' powers could be significantly curtailed. Although the transitional president and prime minister are barred from contesting the December election, the junta appears to be facilitating the return of deposed President Umaro Sissoco Embalo. The military deposed Embalo days after the presidential election, amid competing claims of victory, but before the release of results that were widely expected to be unfavorable to him. Opposition parties and human rights groups have accused the transitional authorities of clearing a path for Embalo while repressing rival political figures. They have also criticized the exclusion of civil society groups from the constitutional drafting process and called for the referendum to be postponed. By securing approval for the new constitution before potentially restoring Embalo to power, the junta is likely seeking to preserve substantial influence over the country through a proxy administration. There is a realistic possibility of protests and localized violence due to the constitutional referendum. Following the November 2025 coup, hundreds of people demonstrated in Bissau to demand Pereira's release, while several civil society groups called for a general strike and a campaign of civil disobedience to restore electoral truth. Further protests took place in April 2026, following the killing of a civil society activist, with demonstrators accusing the security forces of carrying out a politically motivated assassination. Although neither episode developed into widespread unrest, both involved clashes with police who used tear gas to disperse demonstrators. During the post-coup protests, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights also accused the security forces of using lethal force, including live ammunition, against protesters. There is also a realistic possibility of large-scale and widespread civil unrest. Opposition and civil society groups' portrayal of the constitutional referendum as an attempt to legitimize military rule increases the likelihood that they will call for large-scale protests against what they regard as a sham transition process. The security forces' previous use of live ammunition also raises the risk that initially localized demonstrations could develop into a broader movement if footage or reports of a severe crackdown circulate widely on social media. Demonstrations would likely be concentrated in Bissau, where almost a quarter of the population lives. Likely focal points would include the Presidential Palace, the National People's Assembly, and the National Electoral Commission. Further east, drone strikes on Mekelle have increased concerns over renewed conflict between Ethiopia's federal government and Tigrayan forces. Early on August 20th, at least 2 drone strikes were reported in Mekelle, the regional capital of Tigray. The first hit a residential area in the Dero neighborhood of the Hawelti sub-city. According to local news sources, at least 13 residents, including a 2-year-old child, were injured. There was allegedly no military activity in the area at the time of the attack. A second strike was reported shortly afterwards in the Kwiha area, 7.5 kilometers from Mekelle, reportedly targeting an Air Force base. No casualties were reported from this attack. The Ethiopian federal government has not publicly acknowledged responsibility. The Ashenda Festival's main public celebration in Mekelle was subsequently cancelled on August 21st, the day after the drone strikes. The Tigray Culture and Tourism Bureau stated that the cancellation was due to continued drone attacks and fears of renewed conflict. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. This is the first time Mekelle has been targeted amid recent tensions between the government and Tigrayan forces. which have been escalating since the pro-government leader of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front was ousted in March 2025. The Ethiopian National Defense Force has increasingly used drone strikes in Tigray. Their first documented use took place in January when the TPLF accused the ENDF of striking 2 trucks in central Tigray. Further drone attacks were reported in northwestern Tigray in June, and their tempo increased in August, when outright clashes took place between the ENDF and Tigrayan defense forces near the Sudanese border. While 2026 marks the first documented use of drones in Tigray, the government has used them extensively in operations against the Fano militia in Amhara. These attacks have reportedly resulted in widespread destruction and civilian casualties. The increasing use of drone strikes and escalating tensions almost certainly threaten healthcare centers across the region. Human rights organizations have accused combatants across Ethiopia of deliberately targeting healthcare as a tactic, with health facilities targeted in drone strikes and healthcare workers interrogated and executed. Tigray's health system was severely degraded during the 2020 to 2022 conflict, with the healthcare system almost entirely collapsing as health workers were killed and abducted, and premises were looted, occupied, and destroyed. Assessments by the Tigray Health Bureau and the United Nations Children's Fund found that approximately 78% of health centers and 60% of hospitals in Tigray were partially or fully damaged. Only around 1% of medical equipment was left intact. The healthcare system has failed to recover since, and there is evidence of a return to the targeting of healthcare in 2026. Healthcare workers were arrested in July under a regional proclamation punishing alleged dissent. In Amhara, healthcare facilities and ambulances have reportedly been destroyed in government drone strikes in recent months. A return to conflict in Tigray would highly likely see drone strikes targeting healthcare facilities across the region. In a joint statement on August 18, Physicians for Human Rights and the Organization for Justice and Accountability in the Horn of Africa warned of a possible collapse of the healthcare system and called on the Ethiopian government and the international community to protect health facilities and healthcare workers. Staying in the Horn of Africa, Somali piracy is once again on the rise as stretched international naval resources create new opportunities for armed groups. On August 20th, Somali pirates boarded and seized the Eritrean-flagged tanker Cebu 1, approximately 250 kilometers east of Al-Mukalla, Yemen, before reportedly directing the vessel towards Puntland. Cebu 1, which is managed by a UAE-based company, was sanctioned by the US last year over allegations that it formed part of the shadow fleet used by Iran to circumvent international sanctions. The seizure came just 3 days after pirates captured the Cameroonian-flagged cargo vessel Lutuf on August 17th. The vessel was reportedly transporting Turkish weapons towards Mogadishu. On August 23rd, unconfirmed reports circulated in Somali media of an attack on a small boat traveling towards Lutuf, with some accounts alleging that the smaller vessel was struck by a missile. The capture of Lutuf and Cebu 1 marks the 5th and 6th reported seizures of commercial vessels by Somali pirates since late April. The series began with the hijacking of the Palau-flagged tanker Honor 25 off Somalia on April 21st, followed by Sword on April 26th, Eureka on May 2nd, and Asana on July 17th. Following the seizure of Lutuf, maritime intelligence reporting indicated that pirates had used Sword as a mothership to approach the cargo vessel. Sword had also reportedly been used in July to launch attacks against 2 Iranian fishing vessels. Officials from the European Union Naval Force Operation Atalanta stated that they are monitoring the locations of the captured vessels. Before the 2 latest incidents, Atalanta reported that the 4 previously hijacked vessels were being held close together off northern Somalia, with their crews remaining in captivity. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The resurgence in piracy off Somalia has been reported since late 2023 and has intensified significantly during 2026. The Houthi strike campaign in the Red Sea, followed by the start of the Iran conflict, diverted international naval assets away from the vicinity of Somali waters, likely allowing pirates to operate more freely. The seizure of Cebu 1 provides further evidence of the growing ability of Somali pirate action groups to operate at considerable distances from Somalia. PAGs are likely exploiting reduced international naval coverage in the Gulf of Aden and Somali Basin, as naval assets are increasingly stretched by wider regional security requirements, including the persistent missile and drone threat around Yemen. This is likely providing PAGs with greater freedom of movement in the northern waters of the Gulf of Aden, while also reducing deterrence. Using previously captured cargo vessels as motherships almost certainly allows Somali pirates to extend their operational range, while enabling them to blend in with normal commercial traffic. Larger vessels can remain at sea significantly longer than skiffs, operate in poorer weather conditions, and provide fuel provisions and an offshore staging platform from which smaller craft can be deployed against target vessels. This enables pirate groups to operate hundreds of nautical miles from the Somali coastline and reduces their reliance on repeated movements between coastal bases. Moreover, onboard radar systems, AIS equipment, communications systems, electronic charts, and other technology could potentially be exploited to improve pirate communication, coordination, and reconnaissance capabilities. The use of SWORD in a mothership role is likely significant. While Somali pirates have long used captured vessels as motherships, recent incidents have more commonly involved fishing dhows or other fishing vessels. The repeated use of a hijacked commercial cargo vessel would provide pirates with a comparatively more capable platform, offering greater endurance and range, as well as improved onboard navigation and communications capabilities. Given these increased capabilities, there is a realistic possibility that pirates will continue to target similar vessels to further improve their capabilities. Elsewhere in Africa, progress towards peace in the Democratic Republic of the Congo continues to be undermined by fighting between government forces and AFCM-23. On August 24th, a mission to observe the implementation of a ceasefire between the armed forces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and AFCM-23 rebels deployed to Minembwe, South Kivu. This is the first field deployment under a monitoring mechanism established by a Qatar-mediated peace deal signed on November 15, 2025. The deployment was confirmed on August 23 when the DRC government and AFCM-23 issued a joint statement following 5 days of talks in Switzerland. They agreed to pursue negotiations towards comprehensive peace and conflict resolution. The statement added that they had agreed to establish a mechanism tasked with reviewing progress and addressing challenges in implementation of obligations and commitments under the Doha Framework Agreement. Alongside the DRC government and AFCM-23, the talks were attended by representatives from the US, Qatar, Togo, the African Union, and Switzerland. Despite the ongoing peace talks, fighting between the FARDC and AFCM-23 has continued. On August 19th, AFCM-23 and Rwanda conducted a targeted drone strike on a DRC coalition position at the Mwalu Hotel in Fizi District, South Kivu. Senior FARDC and Burundi National Defense Force officials were reportedly staying at the hotel. Following the signing of the declaration, fighting erupted again, with the FARDC carrying out drone strikes against densely populated areas of Mukoko and Nyamabuguma in the Minembwe area. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The Qatar-mediated peace process remains incomplete, with many aspects yet to be fully agreed. Both sides continue to maintain their maximalist demands, with the largest obstacle being the DRC government's demand that AFCM-23 fully withdraw from the territory it has captured. A primary point of contention also remains the disarmament of the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, an ethnically Hutu armed group that Kigali considers a threat. On July 29th, the FDLR agreed in principle to disarm, demobilize, and move into cantonment sites, subject to security guarantees and protection from forced extradition to Rwanda. However, Rwanda rejected this as inconsistent with the Qatar-mediated peace agreement, with officials stating that the deal required the FDLR to be neutralized as a threat. Additional disagreements include AFCM-23's continued role after relinquishing territory, the future of its fighters, and prisoner releases. The ongoing fighting almost certainly reflects the difficulties surrounding the peace negotiations, with rhetoric over a cessation of hostilities failing to be matched by actions amid significant distrust. Since M23 first emerged in 2012, there have been several distinct attempts to establish or implement ceasefires. All have failed, with frequent mutual accusations of ceasefire violations. The ceasefire monitoring mechanism, which comprises members of the Congolese government and AFCM-23, alongside international observers, almost certainly addresses one of the persistent weaknesses of previous ceasefires: the absence of an agreed way to determine who violated the ceasefire. However, persistent distrust almost certainly threatens to undermine the mechanism, with likely internal divisions between AFCM-23 members and government personnel. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, rescue operations are continuing along the Nepal-Tibet border following severe flash flooding and landslides. On August 26th, severe flash flooding occurred in Rasua district on the Nepal-Tibet border. Authorities initially assessed that the flooding followed an ice and rock avalanche, which temporarily blocked an upstream river and formed a lake. The temporary dam subsequently failed, releasing a high volume of water into the Bote Koshi and Trishuli rivers. However, on August 27th, new reporting emerged suggesting that the floods were caused by a glacial collapse, with the impact of the glacier detected by seismometers as a magnitude 5.2 earthquake at around 8:37 a.m. local time. By August 27th, Nepalese authorities had reported that at least 177 people had been killed by the floods, with more than 1,000 still missing. Many of the casualties are foreign tourists, as high-altitude areas in Rasua are popular hiking destinations. Authorities have issued warnings to communities along the Bote Koshi, Trishuli, and Narayani river systems about the risk of further flooding and landslides. The flooding caused severe damage across Rasua, including around Timure and Shabrubesi, and also affected parts of Nuwakot and Dading. There was extensive damage to infrastructure, including roads, bridges, health facilities, and hydropower facilities. Damage along the Betrawati-Rasuagadi road has also disrupted access to the Chinese border and complicated rescue and relief operations. On the Chinese side of the border in Tibet, landslides and flooding affected the Gairong area, with authorities reporting major casualties. Border infrastructure, roads and communications have also been disrupted, affecting cross-border movement. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Although the floods occurred during Nepal's June to September monsoon season, the speed and scale of the event, combined with relatively limited rainfall in Rasua over the previous day, indicate that it was unlikely to have been caused by rainfall alone. However, ongoing monsoon conditions have likely saturated soils, increased baseline river levels, and destabilized slopes, amplifying the severity of the flooding even if rainfall was not the primary trigger. Rasua is particularly exposed to flash flooding caused by glacial activity, avalanches, and landslides. In July 2025, a glacial flood on the same river system killed at least 18 people and damaged the Nepal-China Friendship Bridge and hydropower infrastructure. The recurrence of a major event in the same catchment highlights the continuing risk posed by unstable glaciers, steep slopes, and temporary natural dams in the high Himalayas. Disrupted communications and road access mean that casualty and missing person figures are almost certain to rise as contact is restored with isolated communities. There is a realistic possibility of further flooding and landslides, particularly given ongoing monsoon conditions and the potential for additional slope failures or river blockages. This could pose a continued threat to downstream communities and cause further delays to search and rescue operations. Damage to roads and bridges is also likely to prolong disruptions to the Nepal-China trade corridor, hydropower operations and tourism routes in the Langtang and Rasuagadi areas. Ground evacuation from the worst affected parts of Rasua will almost certainly be heavily constrained for at least the next several days. The destruction of bridges and road corridors, alongside damage to telecommunications and power infrastructure, will complicate relief and evacuation efforts. In Thailand, a wave of coordinated attacks across the Deep South has increased pressure on the government ahead of renewed peace negotiations. Between August 22nd and 23rd, a series of coordinated attacks was recorded across Thailand's restive Deep South, with incidents occurring in Narathiwat, Yala, Pattani, and Songkhla provinces. Upper-end estimates indicate that at least 78 separate incidents occurred, including bombings, arson attacks, gunfire, robberies, and road blockades. An estimated 40 incidents occurred in Narathiwat, 21 in Yala, 15 in Pattani, and 2 in Songkhla. Most took place on the evening of August 22nd, with additional attacks recorded on August 23rd. No fatalities have been reported. However, at least 3 people were injured, including 2 women, by fragmentation associated with an improvised explosive device. The attacks primarily targeted government buildings, commercial premises, telecommunications and electricity infrastructure, vehicles, railway tracks, and other transport infrastructure. The attackers also deliberately damaged CCTV infrastructure at several locations, including roadside cameras, established improvised roadblocks, and dispersed caltrops across several roads. Foreign businesses were also targeted. A 7-Eleven convenience store in Pattani province was attacked during the suspected militant attacks between August 22nd and 23rd, with another 7-Eleven targeted on August 24th. This marks the second wave of coordinated attacks in the Deep South in 2026, following bomb and arson attacks against 11 petrol stations in January. Thai authorities have imposed temporary curfews and movement restrictions in parts of the Deep South following the attacks, alongside road closures, checkpoints, and increased vehicle screening. Security forces have also expanded patrols, searches, and surveillance, while increasing protection around government buildings, transport infrastructure, and other critical sites across the affected provinces. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. No group has claimed responsibility for the attacks. However, their scale, geographical spread, coordination, and nature are broadly consistent with the capabilities and targeting patterns of the Barisan Revolusi Nasional, or BRN. The BRN is the primary insurgent group operating in southern Thailand and has been responsible for thousands of attacks targeting state security forces, infrastructure, and symbols of foreign interference. The attacks occurred as Bangkok seeks to revive Malaysian-facilitated peace negotiations with the BRN and ahead of a 2-day visit to Hat Yai, Songkhla, by Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul and members of his cabinet during the week, beginning August 24th. The visit is expected to focus on investment projects, flood prevention, and local security issues. The timing of the attacks likely indicates that the BRN intended to demonstrate its operational reach, undermine the central government's efforts to project stability in the Deep South, and increase pressure on the current administration to pursue concessions in any renewed peace negotiations. In 2025, the BRN stated that its declared end state was self-government in the Deep South. However, the Fourth Army region has also suggested that the violence may be retaliation for recent security operations targeting local insurgent networks and associated illicit activity. There are currently no indications that the militants will conduct attacks outside the Deep South. The attacks also indicate an effort to degrade government surveillance, freedom of movement, and local security force responses by targeting CCTV networks, transport infrastructure, and telecommunications networks, while using roadblocks and caltrops to further impede counterinsurgency operations. Critically, the attacks were conducted at night, largely targeting infrastructure or unoccupied premises. Occupied premises were reportedly cleared by the militants before improvised explosive devices were detonated or buildings were set alight. These tactics likely indicate a deliberate attempt to minimize civilian casualties by concentrating attacks on infrastructure and property, while avoiding indiscriminate violence against the civilian population. The BRN has been linked to a series of attacks in recent years that resulted in civilian casualties, including direct attacks against Buddhist monks, teachers, local officials, and other civilians perceived to represent or support the Thai state. However, in April 2025, the BRN issued a rare explicit statement saying that it had no policy of targeting civilians and expressed regret over the deaths. This may indicate that civilian casualties have undermined its domestic legitimacy and negotiating position, potentially influencing its targeting patterns and resulting in greater emphasis on infrastructure, state-linked property, and security targets in the Deep South. Prime Minister Anutin Chanvirakul's visit to Hat Yai will likely be delayed to give the military and police time to conduct security operations across the Deep South. If the visit still goes ahead, it will almost certainly result in increased security operations and deployments across Hat Yai and the surrounding areas. There is a realistic possibility that elements of the August 22nd to 23rd attacks were shaping activity, designed to degrade state surveillance, restrict security forces' freedom of movement, and disrupt communications, providing militants with better opportunities to conduct attacks ahead of the visit. There is a realistic possibility of another wave of large-scale coordinated attacks ahead of or during the visit, potentially targeting security forces, government infrastructure, transport networks, and other state-linked assets across the Deep South. Such attacks would likely aim to further undermine the central government during the high-profile visit. And finally, nationwide March for Australia demonstrations are planned for August 30th, with counter-protests and increased policing likely to cause disruption in several major cities. On August 30th, the March for Australia protest movement is scheduled to hold nationwide rallies against the government's perceived restrictions on freedom of speech. Rallies have been organised in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and Canberra. A demonstration in Darwin has not been confirmed, but an active registration page remains online. Organisers claim that recent federal and state legislation has increasingly restricted political expression and have sought to link the demonstrations to broader concerns over immigration and Australian national identity. Several counter-demonstrations have already been organised in major population centres. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The planned demonstrations follow a series of nationwide March for Australia events that began on August 31st, 2025, and primarily focused on opposition to immigration. These protests attracted tens of thousands of participants nationwide and resulted in significant police deployments, counter-demonstrations, and isolated incidents of violence, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney. This round of protests follows the December 2025 Bondi Beach terrorist attack and the subsequent introduction of new federal and state legislation targeting hate speech and extremist groups. However, subsequent March for Australia rallies in January 2026 were markedly smaller than the initial 2025 demonstrations, likely suggesting that the movement has so far struggled to sustain its earlier level of mobilization. However, protests are still likely to attract several thousand participants in the largest cities, particularly Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Counter-demonstrations are being organised at similar times and in nearby locations, increasing the likelihood of confrontations between opposing groups or with the police. Large police deployments, temporary road closures and crowd control measures are likely around demonstration routes and assembly points and will likely result in transport disruption across major cities. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.